Welcome today to Ministry Reads. We are so glad that you're here with us. This is a production of Culture Studios. And this podcast, my name is Krystal. Before I go into what our podcast is, my name is Krystal Correale.
And I'm Vinny Correale.
And we're so glad that you're here with us today because this podcast is going to be exactly what the name is, Ministry Reads. So we will be reading and looking at ministry books, some classic and some current books that look at ministry life, leadership, spiritual life. We're going to be reading them, recapping them, hopefully giving you guys some insight into what the books are all about, pulling out our key takeaways, and just diving into how these books can apply to our lives for those of us who are in ministry or in church life.
Yeah, so we'll have different segments for the episodes. So about the author, we're going to do some fun things like judging the book by its cover. We'll have the Chris Notes section instead of the Cliff Notes for those of you in the 90s that's all you would read because you weren't readers. That would be me. And then some other fun segments as well as we go through. This has actually been a dream of yours for many years to do a podcast about ministry books. And go ahead.
Well, yeah, I do love reading. And so if I could read, and also I love ministry, if I can talk about ministry as well, it kind of combines both of those things. And so it's been both of ours, not just mine.
Yes. But your favorite genre of podcasts, though, is also literary podcasts.
Yes.
Right? And so, like...
I am that nerd that listens to podcasts about books.
So you've been kind of feeling this out for a bit, and we've talked through this for a few years now and kind of been like, hey, we should do this idea.
I don't think something like this really exists where people are talking about ministry books. Like I do listen to all those other podcasts that talk about literary books. And there are lots of ministry podcasts, but here we are taking a look at books each week or every other week and then seeing how it can apply to our ministry lives.
Right. And so you're you're a super reader, right?
I enjoy reading.
There are people that like really read a lot of books. You read a lot of books, sometimes over 100 in a year, sometimes more than that.
It depends on the season of life. Yeah. It hasn't been that many lately.
Right. But so I am not that. Mm-hmm. However, I do love to read ministry books. Mm-hmm. And so if you're going to get me on something, this would be the thing. And so, and that's why we kind of said this would be the genre we wanted to hit on and do this. And I'm excited to kind of launch this off as our first episode. And I think we picked a pretty good book to launch the episode as well.
I'm excited about this one. I would say it's more in that category of classics. You know, it's not brand new. And it's one we've heard about a ton. I'm not sure why we haven't read it before.
Right, we had never read this. So we were like...
So many people have recommended it over the years. I don't know what was holding me back from reading it, but I'm so glad we're starting with this one.
Yeah, I was joking with you the other night, and I was like, I thought it was a kid's book because there was this kid's book, The Tale of Two Kings, and then this is a tale of
the
Three
book.
Kings.
We should probably tell them what it is.
So here it is.
A Tale of Three Kings, Study in Brokenness, which that subtitle is really the key to the whole book. And it's by Gene Edwards.
Yes. And so Gene Edwards, and we'll kind of just give you a little insight into who Gene Edwards is a little bit. Born 1932, when he was younger, he kind of learned that he suffered through something, and they finally diagnosed him with dyslexia. And which I think is pretty cool for us to be doing this, because the person who kind of funds all of this and takes care of our podcast and ministry here with Culture Studios, he suffers from dyslexia as well. So I think it's a great first book for us to dive into, the author suffering from the same thing. So shout out to our head guy, Lance, for our first episode.
Well, it just shows you don't, those kind of things don't have to hold you back.
Right, and you think about Lance was the one that from the very beginning, we told him about this a few years back, and he was like, well, I'm going to buy you equipment, sent us equipment to start our podcast, which was hilarious because then we ended up moving here with them. And now doing ministry together. So here we are. So shout out to them as we are going to get into Gene Edwards. So a little bit more about him was he started a lot of house churches and started a movement back in the 70s that was a house church movement. And being a pastor, went to seminary school and all of that, and just started writing books. And he wrote over 35 books, some of them in collections and things like that. And some of them just on their own. A few of them, Divine Romance is another one that he wrote that we'll probably do a podcast on in the future. But this one was the one that we were like, you know what, this is a great launching point.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And so the book we have right here, The Tale of Three Kings, is a classic. I'm going to say that's classic 1970s cover right there. Nice old book.
So I literally, it's so like by the cover, right? We're going to judge it by the cover. I literally looked at it, I was like, it reminds me of like Flannelgraph. Back in the day, like, like those 70s Sunday school Flannelgraph. You got David
this could
and
be Saul, or it could be like someone else if you just change out the Bible story.
Right, of course, right? Yeah, it depends on what the story was.
But David has the harp. I think he's the only one.
Yes, so you knew who David was. I'm like looking at the cover. But funny about a lot of books have different covers, right? But with this, choosing this cover was fun because I was like, man, it is so... It's an oldie, but a goodie, and by looking at the cover, you think this book is going to be something, and it's completely different.
Yeah,
and
I was just going to say, I think you would be really surprised. So if you haven't read this book, it is short. So not that I want you to leave this video, but you could go read this in 2 hours and come back. Because, even an hour and a half. We talked about how we read this book. Little tip, if you're a struggling reader, audiobooks are amazing.
They are.
And so you check your library. We had this in our library, so our library app. And so listen to the audio and read the book at the same time.
Right.
Because it really helps you focus.
And what's good with that is that if you speed up the audio, I can't listen to just the audio at like regular speed because I listen to podcasts and things like that. And I'm always on 1.75 or higher. So that's how my brain processes things now. And so when you told me about it, I had never read a book that way besides the Bible because I like reading the Bible and the audio at the same time. But reading a book that way is a great way to read a book.
Yeah,
it was
helps your mind stay focused and keeps you on there.
Thoroughly enjoyed reading this book.
And the book itself, it's not just a regular nonfiction book,
right? So
getting into the book, it's actually an allegory. And so the author is a very
creative,
a powerful author. And he uses a story, obviously, of David.
Yep.
And obviously, Tale of Three Kings. We have King David, who we know does become king. And we have the first part with King Saul, the very first king of Israel, and the second half of the book with King Absalom, which is David's son. And the study in brokenness comes in as we're looking at David, who's the main character, and what does it look like when King Saul is reigning on the throne, and what does it look like then when David's on the throne and someone's coming after him?
Yeah, so let's kind of dive into the Chris Notes version of the book in the sense of you're just going to kind of recap it and, give everybody some tidbits of how the story plays out. It is, you're going to say it, so I'm going to pause what my thought. I'm pretty sure you're going to say it. If you don't, I will dive right back into it.
You have permission to interrupt, as we always do.
Yes, we do, but hopefully respectfully.
Always.
Yes, always.
All right.
Go ahead.
So we have the story was the author wrote it in response to problems in the modern church when you have leadership, right?
And this is back in the day.
Yeah, even back in the day, back in the 70s. And it's even more applicable applicable nowadays when we look at church leadership and pastors and big ministries, even small churches and ministries like that. And what does it look like when you're in a position and the leader above you or leaders around you, you believe are not following the will of God and not being a true good leader? And so, again, starts with David. Now, David was obviously anointed to be king of Israel, even though Saul was king.
Right.
And he was anointed to be king of Israel. And then that didn't happen for another 10 years. And so what does it look like when you believe or you feel that you could be in a position of leadership and the leader who is in charge, King Saul, who God put there, is now not walking in obedience, is living a, double standard life, is doing things that are not right, all these wrong things. Yeah. But they're in leadership. What does that look like?
Yeah, I had a sermon that I preached a few years back, kind of in regards to this setup. It was called From Anointing to Appointing with a Lot of Disappointing.
Yes. And that is it for David right there, because what does it look like when you're looking at the other people in leadership?
Right.
And this whole allegory just brings it back to ourselves.
Yeah.
What is our heart's response to it? Because it's not about pointing the faults out in others. It's about making sure that our hearts are pure. Right. Because God wants to remove the King Saul out of each and every one of us.
Right. And I think that's what the author does. I mean, it's a story, right? And it's more like a, how do you put it? It's like a theater show. You know what I mean? That's what I kind of thought of it as, like more like a production, right? Like this is
the cast of characters that you're watching.
And you're watching this play basically play out in front of you. And he just creatively tells the story of King Saul, King David, King Absalom, and Absalom. And it's like, man, and he shares it in a way that you just never have thought of it this way.
Yeah. And your instinct is to point the fingers and be like, King Saul is horrible. And you're like, oh, but wait a minute.
Right.
That King Saul is in me.
Right. And that's what's crazy about it. And it's like, but he says some things too that is like, doesn't make King Saul to be that bad of a guy. Right. In the sense of, he brings up like points of like, but if you were the first king, right, of a nation, how would you respond when transition's going to take place, right? And it's like Saul really didn't know how to react and respond. And a lot of us in our circumstances, when there's, power and whatever, we don't respond the right way.
Yeah. And which Saul obviously did not.
Right. And so it's saying like, hey, we have that ability within us to act that way. We have the ability in us to act like David acted, and we have the ability in us to act like Absalom. So what is your response to each situation and scenario? Yeah. Because there's different scenarios in these in parts as well.
Yeah. And that's the whole key right there, is our response. So Saul, where he knows that David has been anointed and is going to be, could be the next king, is then filled with jealousy. And the whole, again, we have it on the cover here, the whole concept of Saul throwing spears at David is those attacks, those personal attacks, instead of Saul being in the will of God and being on the throne and leading as a spiritual king. He just feels threatened and then is attacking David. But David's response, that time of this brokenness where David is not taking the spear and throwing it back at Saul. He's running away from the attacks, dodging the attacks, and trying to do the right thing, because as we know David's famous words, like don't touch the anointed, the anointed one. That's when David goes through some of his greatest growth. He wrote so many of the Psalms in
Yep.
those years of brokenness out in the wilderness. He grew in his character because his responses revealed his heart.
Right. Yeah, it's really good. And you look at like, and I know we're going to kind of dive into some of this maybe a little bit, but you look at the church today and how this applies. And I can't wait to get to that point so we can, it's like, it's so relevant today. But yeah, continue with the whole part 2 and part 1 and part 2.
Yes.
Because we talked about Saul here.
Yeah.
So.
Well, and the whole concept of David and all that time that he didn't attack Saul because the passing of time reveals characteristics about the leader, right? Because that's kind of the big bringing it back for a second, that's kind of the big question, is like, is this leader, whoever it might be in your life, your pastor, your leader of an organization, are they in the order of King Saul, meaning are they the bad guy? But we will never know the answer to that, but their actions will reveal things over time,
Right.
So over time, King Saul's actions revealed his true character, his true heart. But the same thing is true of us. The passing of time and our reaction to our leader reveals our heart.
Right. So, and you look at David's life, his reaction was always, I am going to honor what's in front of me, right? I'm going to honor who God put in front of me, right? I'm going to honor the position that's in front, that's above me. Now, he was anointed to be that. But it wasn't his time to be that yet.
It wasn't his time.
And so for him to sit back and allow the spears to be thrown, allow the attacks to happen, allow all of that to happen and saying, this isn't for me to take care of. This is for God to take care of. And you see the character of David in his, as he's been broken and humbled. And brought, like you look at, you can see it from the get-go when you're anointed, to be the king, and then you're placed in a position of harp player, right? Like, how humbling is that?
Yeah, soothing the madman.
You have to soothe the anger of the person that you're taking that position. And you're there and you're playing the harp for that person. That person gets mad at you and is like trying to take you out, and still you're honoring that person throughout that person's life. That is a testament of humility and of character and of honor.
And when those moments happen, I think the biggest question is, like, if we have that in our lives where we actually think, because we don't know if it's a King Saul in our lives, what does that look like? What should our response be? And if we're humble and, we don't throw the spears back and we do everything, we see that David did leave the situation, but he left in a way that was still honoring. He didn't leave and take a rebellion with him.
Exactly.
He left by himself, and he left to, leave King Saul in his position and trust that God would bring David himself.
Yeah, it's really good. I'm thinking like of emotions, right? And like you look at Saul was an emotional guy.
Yeah.
Right? Very emotional, very but his emotion was anger.
Yes.
His emotion was, fear, threat. He felt threatened. There was a fight mentality for him, right? Where you look at David, right? And his emotion was brokenness, right? He was, instead of being, his emotion was tears, right? His emotion was, I cry out, right? I cry out to the Lord, right? Lord, handle my enemies, like take care of this, though I'm surrounded, right? But you're with me, right? And it's like, you see the emotion where Saul is like, just kill, you know what I mean? David is like, I need to get away from this situation. His response to fear is the flight side of it, where he just went away from it and waited on God to handle things, right? And it's like,
didn't cause up people to go against the leadership, the King Saul.
And so you look at the ways people respond in brokenness, is a few different ways, and you got a third way coming up.
Yeah, and God is looking for someone who is trustworthy.
Right.
So Saul was going to be removed because he wasn't a trustworthy vessel. And David was going to be put in that position in his time.
Right.
Because when you just are basing your leadership on just a gifting, that's like an outward empowerment. But if you are trusting God and you have the brokenness, then that's an inward transformation.
Right.
So David was being transformed inside. So
Yeah.
these big things that were happening and helped him down the road, as we're going to see as he's then king, was made in these early decisions where he honored the King Saul and
Right.
still honored that. So then the second part of that, after then King David is king, and we see down the road, decades later, he's an old man. He then has his son, one of his sons, Absalom, who the Bible says he's handsome, he's got following, he seems like a good guy, but he starts listening to all the people around him.
Right.
And the problem is he started looking at King David, he started looking at the kingdom and saying, but if I was in charge, I'd do it this way. If I was in charge. So he's letting the people come to them with their, problems. I'm just going to listen.
Right.
Well, if I was in charge, I'd do this.
Right.
I wouldn't do it that way.
Yeah.
And that's the heart of the rebellion right there.
Yeah. And so that's the story.
Yeah.
Right. So that's like basically the thrust of the book, the recap of the book.
And then how David deals with Absalom, his own son, coming to take his throne.
Was the same way he dealt with Saul.
Because he already had made those decisions.
It was, okay, I'm just going to let God deal with it. Mm-hmm. And God deals with it how he deals with it.
Yeah.
Right? Gets rid of the situation. And then Solomon comes into play after that, right? I think I'm right on this. Yeah. And so, but that's not the end of the book there. It just ends with King David. But as we kind of look at this from an application standpoint, right? How can we, as ministry leaders, apply this in our ministries?
Well, I think we have to, like David, over and over again, was mindful of the position, because even King Saul, if he has a gifting, he could be sinning, but God has still placed him in that place. So God is the one who will take care of the sin, judge the sin, do that. God removes kings and authorities because he's the one who's put them there.
Right.
So our responsibility is not to point fingers at someone else and say, they're in the order of King Saul. It's to remember, no, in my heart, there's going to be the order of King Saul, and Lord, remove that. Let me be broken.
Right.
And it's the difference between praying for just the power of God, and praying for the will of God.
It's good.
So God, I want your will. What is your will in this situation? Because we don't know if that leader is, of the order of Saul, or of the order of David.
Right.
Only time will tell. But God does know the answer to that. So God, what is your will?
Right.
How can I honor this situation? How can I honor that position that they've been put in by you?
Yeah.
And how can my heart be right?
Yeah. I think this book is for every leader in your church.
Yes.
I think it's not just for your pastoral staff, but for your leaders and your people that serve under you, so that they can recognize how they respond and how they would want to respond. Because I think it's crazy to think about in the church today, we're still dealing with these three mentalities, right? I think a lot of churches have leaders that are Saul, they were the first ones. They started that church, and they don't know how to leave that church, right? And if anybody comes behind them, that there's that fear, and there's that, nope, you're not taking over this, you're not going to do that. I think that happens in a lot of churches. Mm-hmm. I think that many churches out there have that kind of mentality where I've started this from the ground up. There's nobody that's going to take over my throne. And unfortunately, it's not yours, it's God's.
It's God's.
And so
then you have the Absaloms who would look at the situation and say,
exactly.
I could do it better.
And then you have those young kids that are coming up and that are saying, yeah, and they, the pastor lets them preach a couple times, and they hear from everybody else. Oh, you're so good. Why aren't you the pastor? You're so good. This, that, the other. That's happened to us. Like, that's like real life, where people like hear, you preach or hear you teach or whatever. And they're like, hey, you should be the guy. Why aren't you the guy? And then you're like, what the heck do I do with that?
Yeah.
And it's how you respond in those moments that show who your character really is.
Yeah.
And, through the years, we've been in ministry. This is why we're doing this. We've been in ministry over 20 years, almost 25. We're old. Well, we're old. And we've been doing this for a long time, and we've seen every one of these situations play out in ministry. And what we have learned is that it's not about me. It's all about him, and allowing him, right, to utilize my brokenness, right, and break me to the point of being the humble servant that I'm supposed to be as a minister to the Lord.
Yeah.
Right. And knowing that God put me in a position of leadership, not to take over positions, but to be somebody that can help the people in leadership as well. Are there times where I've been the head? Yes. Are there times where I've been the lowest of the low? Yes. And it's okay to be in any of those positions and serve the Lord.
Yeah.
And
it's about serving. It's about our hearts, because God doesn't honor division. He doesn't honor that.
It's really good.
In the kingdom. Like, that's not going to be honored. So he looks at our hearts. Are our hearts honoring God? Are they for the kingdom,
right,
and not for our own self-interests? Because he doesn't want, rebellion, division, that has no place in God's kingdom.
Yeah, I think, and I also think, staying with the application, I think the biggest problem in the church today is the Absaloms. I think that a lot of people react and respond like an Absalom, where they think they can do it better. They can one-up whoever's in charge. And so then they start a ministry out of anger, out of resentment, out of
desire for power,
right? And it's like, you don't see how broken you really are. Like, you don't see how that's not how you should be starting. Well, that's not how you should be.
The roots of your ministry matter. And so,
right.
Starting something like that.
And we're not talking about any church in particular. This happens over and over again, where people do things because they think that they can do it better and don't take under advisement or leave places in a completely negative way.
Well, yeah, and we have been blessed to be at churches that have taught us honor in the right biblical way, that if you are, ministry, there should be multiplication. Yeah. Not division.
Really good.
That's the difference.
Yeah.
And so when
when
you do it in
say that for those in the back.
When you do it in a God honoring way, and you go through leadership and you have anointing and you have blessing, then there is multiplication.
Right.
Instead of being like an Absalom and going out on your own and trying to divide and take people with you.
Right.
That's not going to be a blessing. There won't be multiplication on that. And so it matters where our heart is and what we're doing. We could be doing an action, but if our heart is not in the right place, and God is the one who sees that. He's the only one who can judge. Right. And the people around us can't judge our hearts. They can judge our actions. They can see what the fruit of it is, 10, 20 years down the road. But God's the one who sees our hearts.
It's really good. And so that gets us into the next segment of like quotable quotes.
Yes,
right?
There were some good ones.
And so we had some really good quotable quotes that we want to kind of share with you, if we can pull them up on our system here. And we got them.
High tech.
We are very high tech.
Put that computer on airplane mode.
Yes.
Stop calling.
But yeah, so these are some quotes from the book. You've kind of hit on a few of them already. Mm-hmm.
Sorry if I was taken away from some of your. I couldn't help it.
Right, you said some of these already, but let's kind of go through the first one is, and this is one of the themes of the book, when you get into it, it's said multiple times in the book. It's God knows, but he won't tell.
Yes. Like he knows, like I just said, he knows our hearts. He's not going to come and say, oh, that's right. That leader, he's a King Saul.
Right.
Like that's not God. He's not telling us. But because it's about our hearts, it comes back to that. He wants our hearts to be in the right place. So Lord, remove King Saul from my heart.
Right. It's also, God's not telling us exactly what to do in certain circumstances. Right? Like we're praying for God's will for our lives, right? And there's so many times in our lives where we've been like, okay, God, what do you want me to do in this circumstance? Right? And you see David the same way, is like, okay, I'm not really sure how to handle this situation.
Yeah, my son
God,
is coming for my throne.
Right? And
what do I do now?
And it's like, well, God knows, but he's not going to tell you. And so he wants you to make that call, and where David made the right call, and it just, I'm going to let the Lord handle it.
Yeah.
Right. And
because if he had taken action against his own son, he then would have become King Saul.
Right.
He would have stepped right into that order of King Saul by being murderous and stopping his own son.
Right.
But instead, he let God take care of
right.
him.
And it just goes to show you that can be in all of us. Right.
Yeah.
But then you look at like David, such a warrior, how many people he killed, so many people, right? Like as a warrior, going
enemies.
And it's like, you
then
look at it,
his two biggest,
but his two biggest enemies.
Yeah.
He's
he
like, no,
didn't lay a hand on them.
This is this is for God to handle.
Yeah.
It's crazy to think about. And you said, you actually said this, the second quote here, God always notices the attitude behind the act.
Yeah.
And I think that a lot of us need to understand that. It's not the act that matters. It's our attitudes behind it.
Yeah.
Right.
And that goes up with the next point. How you look to others may be irrelevant. How you look to God means everything.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter what our actions look like to others. It's God.
Right.
God knows our true heart.
Yeah, so good. I love this. Great leaders do not demand loyalty; they inspire it.
Yes.
And I mean,
yeah, and David, even when he wasn't king, had the songs being sung about him, how he had the tens of thousands, right? And or killing the tens of thousands, and he had all these people singing about him, and he wasn't demanding loyalty, but the people.
Right, he inspired it through his actions, right? Through his actions, through his attitude, through how he responded to things, how he did things. When you're showing up and you're killing the giant, right? That's your action, right? And his attitude behind it was incredible, right? Was that this is what you're coming after, my God. You're coming after, this right now. And it's like, you see how the people responded to that. It was inspiration, right? So really cool. Again.
I was going to say, and then a true leader doesn't fear the consequences of obeying God.
Yeah.
Like, when God tells you to do something, you're supposed to be obedient, then you don't have to worry about the consequences of that and what people might think when we obey God. Like, David's leaders wanted him to stop Absalom and kill him and stop him, and David wasn't willing to do that.
Well, David's men wanted him to kill King Saul.
Yeah,
he wasn't about that either,
he wasn't gonna
right?
Do it. So it was obeying God that was what mattered to him, not what his men thought.
Yeah, and it's like if we can get that as leaders. Right? If we can get that man, if we could just obey God in everything that we do. The thing that's terrible is what I'm afraid of is when I disobey God. Like the consequences of that, man, you know what I mean? Like you look at the Bible, it's always disobedience that brings destruction, right? And it's like obedience always brings a blessing. So, and that's how we've kind of lived our life in obedience and walking it out. And so I love that quote. Another one is, great leaders do not seek the approval of man. They seek the approval of God.
Yep.
And I think that we'll end our quotable quotes on that one because I think that is really what it's about. how you respond, how you act, and how you live your life based upon not the approval of man, but the approval of God.
Yeah.
And, walking out your brokenness in front of other people in your leadership style is going to be revealed. And that's what this book really shows you.
God wants to put his power and authority on men and women whose hearts are right, who are contrite, broken vessels for God. That's who he wants to have in leadership, and that's what we should strive to be.
Yeah, so we'll end on the takeaway. What's your takeaway from the book? And
I wrote it down, so let's make sure I can get let me not forget what my actual takeaway is.
It's going to be above that.
It is going to be above that. Oh, yes. And I mentioned it already because I couldn't stop myself. But God never honors division in his kingdom.
Yeah.
That's not how the kingdom of God works. The, earthly kingdoms, governments are all different than how God's kingdom runs. And those things in our lives that come at us, the things that attack us, the things that we don't understand, why, when you work with people who you're like, I can't believe they did that to me, or this, those spears that are being thrown at us, God uses them to produce our character. So just like David, when he was getting the spear thrown at him, that was about his growth and his development in the Lord and his character and his heart. And so when you look at your circumstance and you're wondering, is my leader a King Saul? No, flip that back to ourselves, and how can the spears that are being thrown at me produce better character, and let me not create division, because that's not part of God's kingdom.
Yeah. So my takeaway is never follow the will of man, but follow the will of God that's in that man. Does that make sense? Because in every man, God is showing us his will. Now it's whether or not we're following his or man's. And I think that as you look at it, David, and the Bible talks, he's a man after God's own heart. He knew that he knew how to follow God in the right way. Despite mess ups, despite mishaps, despite things like that, he was still contrite, right? He humbled himself, tore his clothes. He did the right things when he did something wrong, right? But he did a lot of things right.
Yeah.
And it's knowing how to respond in each and every circumstance that matters. And when you're broken, and when you and how you respond is important. And we talk how leaders need to respond in certain situations. This book will teach you just that, how you can respond through your enemies coming at you, through troubles, through triumphs, through all of that. Tale of Three Kings is a pretty good book.
Highly recommend it. It's a eye-opening look into yourself, not even just to the leadership around you, but how do you respond to leadership. So we recommend reading it. It'll be surprising, and it'll open up your eyes and hopefully your heart.
Right. So as we've done our first episode, kudos to you. You did it. We finally have one done. But make sure you subscribe, do all those YouTube-y things, right? Make sure you ring the bell so you get notified of when we're going to be doing our next episode. This is going to be a bi-weekly show to start with. And we'll see where it goes from there. And check out. You
can always comment some books that you might be interested in us covering.
Yes, we're going to be on YouTube. We're going to be on Facebook, Instagram, all those kind of platforms. So make sure you're checking us out there. She might put some things on there of some other books that she recommends as well. Maybe we're not covering in the podcast right now, but some books that we're currently reading, all that kind of stuff. So we're close out the episode, babe.
Yeah. So thank you for joining us. Make sure, like you said, subscribe so you can join us for next time. This is a great book. We highly recommend it. A Tale of Three Kings. It'll be a look into your own heart. And we pray that that when you read this, that God will have transformation in your heart to make us more like a King David and to take the Saul and the Absalom out of our hearts,
Amen.
as I know that we all desire to have a heart that is after God. So thank you for joining us, and we hope to see you soon.